Black Hollow Correctional Facility had always held its secrets tight, but the night Officer Elena Hart vanished, the silence changed heavier, watching, alive. No cameras caught her. No one saw her leave. The only other guard on duty had a history. She tried to report ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Years later, behind a sealed wall not marked on any blueprint, her uniform was found folded beside a diary, with entries written after her disappearance. Now the prison is abandoned, but the knocking hasn't stopped, and those who enter hear her footsteps, still pacing, still trapped, with something that was never meant to be woken. Black Hollow Correctional Facility, a forgotten concrete carcass buried deep in the Appalachian woods and suffocated by moss-choked fences, was the kind of place that didn't echo with footsteps so much as absorb them, swallowing sound the way. It swallowed time, a place where steel doors groaned like dying animals, and the hallways were always just a little too dark, no matter how many bulbs you replaced. And on the night Officer Elena Hart disappeared March 12, 1991, the storm outside was already grinding its way through the mountains, rattling chain-link fences and screaming across rusted rooftops, while inside, the silence was so thick it felt alive, like it had lungs of its own, and was just waiting to exhale. Elena, a quiet but respected officer known for her precision and discipline, had worked the night shift 100 times before and knew the place better than most, navigating those rotten corridors like muscle memory, writing her notes in neat cursive on thin government paper with the kind of detachment that came from years of routine. But that night there was something off in the air, not just the tension of incoming weather, but something colder, heavier, a pressure in her chest that didn't quite make sense. And yet she pushed through her rounds with the same steady pace, logging her final report at 11:07 p.m. with the usual notation. Cell Block D cleared. All secure? After that, nothing, not a word, not a noise, not even a flicker of motion on the grainy, half-functioning monitors that only covered 2 wings of the entire prison. And when Officer Curtis Dale, the only other person officially on duty that night, was questioned the following morning, he merely shrugged and said she'd mentioned forgetting something in the break room and walked off toward the East Hall, never to return, a story he repeated with the same hollow cadence in every interview, every debrief, every follow-up, like a man reading from a page he didn't write, but had memorized far too well. Curtis, who was already a source of discomfort among staff due to his unsettling silence and peculiar obsession with Officer Hart, an obsession she had documented in several internal complaints that went unanswered or misfiled, was never formally charged, never suspended, never even transferred, and though the other guards whispered and glanced sideways when he passed, no one could prove anything because there were no cameras in that hallway, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no screams, just a name on a timesheet, a badge that went unreturned, and an empty locker sealed up 2 days later like it was a coffin. The internal investigation dragged for months, producing nothing except worn-out statements and an eventual administrative shrug. And by the time 2 years had passed with no sightings, no calls, no remains, Elena Hart was declared legally dead, and her mother was handed a folded uniform in a plain white box. A box that contained no answers, only symbols of absence, while Curtis Dale quietly resigned the following winter, disappearing from Black Hollow without ceremony, leaving behind only rumors, reports, and something far worse, an unresolved silence that never truly left the building. 10 years had passed since Officer Elena Hart's disappearance, and Black Hollow had only grown older, its bones more brittle and its guts more unpredictable, with entire wings falling into decay faster than the state could approve funding to repair them. And so when the maintenance team arrived in the spring of 2001 to assess a suspected pipe collapse near the abandoned laundry wing, no one thought much of it because the prison had always creaked and sighed like a dying house, and corners of it were so forgotten that even the rats walked slow. But when the crew tore open a section of crumbling wall and found not pipes, but hollow space behind it, what they uncovered was not a maintenance issue. It was a secret. A room sealed behind 4 layers of reinforced concrete, completely without ventilation or visible access. A place not marked on any blueprint and unknown. To every living employee, the air inside was dry and smelled like rusted iron and wet paper. And the single bulb hanging from the ceiling was shattered as if something had broken it from below. Not above, and against one wall stood a narrow cot covered in mildew-stained fabric with a cracked leather-bound book placed directly at its center, its cover brittle, its corners curled, and inside that book, beneath the dust and decay, was the unmistakable handwriting of Officer Hart. Her name etched on the inside cover in the same neat looping script she used in her incident reports. The ink faded, but still legible. And as the investigators flipped through the pages in stunned silence, they found an account of days that officially never happened, written by a woman who had supposedly vanished into thin air. The entries starting calmly, noting strange noises behind the pipes and a deep vibration in the walls, and then growing more frantic, more disoriented, as if she were being watched by something without eyes, something that didn't need light to see. The final entry, dated March 14th, 1991, 2 days after she went missing, was short and scrawled in uneven letters that bled through the paper. Reading only. Curtis put me here, but something else found me. Something older than this place. It lives behind the noise. I hear it crawling. Next to the cot lay her name tag, scratched and rusted, and a torn piece of her uniform sleeve, folded neatly as if someone or something had preserved it deliberately. And smeared across the far wall was a dark stain the forensic team could never fully analyze, a human-adjacent residue with no DNA match and no biological origin, something that wasn't blood but had once touched something living. And though the official report would later describe the scene as inconclusive, the expressions of those who entered the room that day told a different story. One of nausea, disbelief, and something more primal fear, not of Curtis Dale, nor even of what had happened to Elena Hart, but of the fact that a room like this could exist at all in a facility that was supposed to be mapped, catalogued, and empty. A room with no doors, no windows, no reason to exist, and yet it had been there all along, waiting. When word of the hidden room reached the department, the case was pulled from its cold shelf and dragged back into the light like a forgotten corpse unearthed by shifting earth. And with it came a storm of headlines, speculation, and pressure that rippled outward like shockwaves in a still lake. But none of it mattered more than the name that reappeared on every document, every memo, every urgent email. Curtis Dale, now retired and withering quietly in a salt-bitten trailer on the coast of Maine. A man who had faded into obscurity with the same eerie ease with which he had once blended into the empty corridors of Black Hollow. And though he claimed he had no memory of the room, no knowledge of the diary, no connection to the items discovered, within it, his voice strained, dry, unconvincing, betrayed the kind of unease that couldn't be faked, the kind that came not from fear of being accused, but from fear that something long buried had decided it wasn't finished with him yet. Denied it all, over and over, denied knowing the room, denied sealing Elena inside, denied even understanding what she could have meant in those final entries. And though the police couldn't formally tie him to the chamber without irrefutable evidence, and though the fingerprints had long since faded, and the timeline remained just uncertain enough to protect him from prosecution, the detectives who sat across from him swore later that they had never felt more watched, not by Curtis, but by something just beyond the room, just behind the windows, as if their presence had stirred not just guilt, but attention. And then came the moment that shifted everything. The prison, still barely operational, still decaying under limited staff and reduced funding, had kept the South Wing sealed once again after the discovery. But that hadn't stopped one of the older inmates, Jerome Wicks, convicted of triple homicide in 1989 and left to rot in solitary ever since, from claiming that just a year ago. Well, before the room was found, he had seen her, not in a dream, not in a vision, but saw her, walking the hallway past his cell with her keys jingling and her uniform pressed as if it were still 1991, her face blank and her eyes unfocused, her lips moving soundlessly like someone whispering underwater. And when shown a photo of Elena, heart-aged, creased, color-faded, he didn't blink before nodding slowly and saying, "That's her." She walked right past. I thought she was dead, but she looked right at me. And then she was gone. At first, they dismissed him hallucination, age, madness, but then the lights in cell block E began to flicker. The plumbing in the South Wing screamed at night, with no pressure issues. And one guard claimed he was locked inside the maintenance closet for over 3 hours, despite the lock being broken for years. And when they opened the door, he was curled on the ground, muttering something about eyes watching from behind the walls. And so the question changed not who killed Elena, Hart, but what exactly was awakened when that room was broken open, and why, after all these years, it still remembered Curtis Dale by name. By the time the prison warden received the order to shut down Black Hollow permanently, most of the South Wing had already been sealed with corrugated steel and concrete slurry, not for safety, not for structure, but because every single crew, member who entered it, electricians, welders, even the state inspection officer, reported the same unbearable pressure behind the walls, the kind that made your vision bend and your ears ring and your thoughts slide sideways as if some low sound, far below hearing but deep in the body, was vibrating everything loose from the inside out. And though no one would put it in writing, more than one worker refused to return after just a single hour inside, citing migraines, nosebleeds, voices that sounded like water dripping backwards, and shadows that moved in places where there was no light at all. Curtis Dale, now sick and withered, and hiding in hospice care behind a fake name and a curtain that never quite closed, began speaking. To himself in fractured loops about corridors that don't end, and hands that slide out of pipes slick with memory and teeth. Not human ones, but something wide and flat like bone chisels. And though the nurses tried to ignore it, one of them, young, inexperienced, and curious, sat with him one night and asked what he meant when he whispered, "It's not done chewing." And he looked at her like he'd just been pulled up from a deep pool and said, "You can bury a door, but it still opens if someone knocks the right way." The knocking started a week later, not loud, not sudden, but persistent measured taps heard at exactly 3:17 a.m. for 6 nights straight in the southern wall of the hospice facility, which just so happened to be made of repurposed brick hauled years earlier from the demolished sections of Black Hollow. And when they tore open that wall on the 7th night, expecting a rodent nest or faulty pipe, they found nothing but a single item lodged between bricks, Elena Hart's original flashlight, scuffed and cold and still faintly smudged with dried fingerprints that didn't match Curtis, didn't match any officer, didn't match anyone in the state database. And beneath the casing, etched into the inner metal with something sharp, were 5 words, "It's still in the walls." The demolition crew delayed twice, then 3 times, and finally canceled the full teardown of Black Hollow altogether, citing insurance concerns and structural instability. But those close to the project whispered that the real reason sat deeper, that the earth beneath the prison had been scanned and was found to be hollow in places it shouldn't be, shaped not by erosion or time, but by intention, as if something vast and old had carved out rooms for itself where men had once locked other men away, and now it was waking up, slowly, hungrily, remembering names, remembering blood, remembering the girl in the uniform who listen too closely to the silence and learn too late that the thing behind the bricks does not forgive, does not forget, and above all is not let go. By the time the final investigation was quietly terminated and the last files regarding Officer Elena Hart were boxed up and marked for permanent storage in a federal archive facility that nobody ever actually visits, the prison had already become something more than condemned, more than avoided, more than forgotten. It had become a place people refused to speak about directly, referred to only by vague gestures and lowered voices. A stain on the map that was never erased, but simply blurred around the edges, like an old wound no one dared press on, not because it hurt, but because the pain had evolved into something deeper, something buried under skin and memory and time, and yet still pulsing faintly, like a second heartbeat beneath the floor. And though the official word was that demolition had been halted indefinitely due to structural instability, the truth was buried beneath layers of half-lies and deferred reports. Because somewhere along the way, quietly, subtly, without announcement, the crew hired to begin excavation found something below the foundation that should not have existed at all, something not made by tools or poured with concrete, something too wide to be a tunnel, but too narrow to be a chamber, winding like a vein deep under the west yard. And when they tried to map it, equipment failed, batteries drained, the temperature dropped by 12 degrees in under 90 seconds, and one of the junior crew members, a 23-year-old named Lyle Mathers, emerged from the entrance, pale and trembling, mumbling about a staircase that led nowhere, doors that breathed, and a smell he described as like wet teeth and burnt photographs. And after that he refused to return, quit the job, and vanished off-grid 2 weeks later. Course, all of that never made it into the reports. And just as the threads began to fray at their most delicate points, as witnesses recanted and blueprints changed, and every department involved tried to pretend the structure beneath Black Hollow was geological rather than intentional, something else began to happen, something subtle, something slow, something that took its time like a beast stretching after too long a sleep. And it began, not in the prison itself, but in the people who had entered it during that last wave of investigation, people like Detective Miriam Rhodes, who had read every page of Elena's diary and swore that the final entry, the one scratched across the inner back cover in a different ink, barely legible and almost erased, had not been there when the book was first opened, an entry that read only, "You're not supposed to look at it." And after that, Rhodes started seeing shapes reflected in monitors that were off, and hearing water running where there were no pipes, and began drawing spirals in the margins of every notepad she used until her supervisor placed her on leave for erratic behavior. And she was just the first. Others followed parole officers, forensics techs, even the night janitor, who had swept the chamber after the evidence was collected, all of them speaking in similar fragments, describing the same things they couldn't have possibly coordinated, things like walls that whispered, without words, drafts that carried the scent of dirt and metal, and something older than either, and each of them, eventually, reported the exact same recurring dream, standing in the south wing of the prison, the hidden room wide open and filled with fog, and at the far end, crouched and breathing, something impossibly tall folding itself to fit inside the space, moving. Without moving, its limbs bending in places that had no joints. And its eyes, if they were eyes, glowing not with light, but with memory, like it knew them all by name, and was simply waiting for each of them to come back. Curtis Dale died with his mouth open and his eyes wide, not from pain or violence or fear, but as if something had shown itself to him in the final moment, something he recognized and yet could not speak about. And when the hospice nurse tried to close his eyes, she swore they would not stay shut until the room had been cleared of every mirror, every screen, every reflective surface, as if some part of him was still looking, still watching, till trapped in that moment where the truth slipped through. The cracks of his mind like water through stone dot, and now, even with the prison sealed behind state fences and warning signs, the locals know to stay away, not just out of superstition or rumor, but because something lingers there, something hungry, and patient and impossibly still, something that waits behind the deepest wall and listens for footsteps, something that remembers Elena Hart not just as a woman or a victim, but as the one who heard it first, who listened too long, too closely, and was pulled across that invisible threshold between what the world allows and what it cannot contain. And some say that if you stand at the southeast corner of the old yard, right where the dirt slants down into the earth, and the grass no longer grows, you can hear it even now, the faint rhythmic clinking of keys on a belt, moving just out of view, always moving, never stopping, as if the loop never closed, as if she's still walking the same endless patrol inside a prison that no longer holds anyone except her, and the things she saw, and the things it brought with it. And others swear that if you put your ear to the drain pipe beneath the infirmary, the one that no longer connects to anything, the one that leads into blackness so complete it eats the light, you'll hear a voice not crying, not screaming, not even calling for help, but knocking, slow and steady and patient, as if it's been waiting for you this entire time, and only now realizes you're close enough to finally open the door, not with your hands, not even with a key, but simply by knowing it's there. And the worst part, the part none of them say out loud, but every single one feels, is the certainty, the sickening, absolute certainty that once it's opened, it doesn't close again.